Hey there, everyone. I want to make sure that you can see us and hear us. If you can, please let me know in the chat box so that I know that we are broadcasting and everyone can see the video, hear me. Christine seems to indicate this is looking fine. Paul, why don't you say hello? Make sure everybody can hear you as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul.
All right. Everybody can hear Paul too? Great. Thank you. Okay.
Good.
So everyone, I am super excited to have you join us for today's Stylus author webinar with Paul Hanstedt with his book, Creating Wicked Students, which I read and reviewed on You've Got This podcast, and I can throw a link to that in the chat at some point here. But love this book. So excited to talk with Paul about how it came to be. We are going to be accepting questions throughout today's webinar in the Q&A section of this kind of tool. You can see that probably down at the bottom of your screen where it says ask a question. And that allows me to timestamp Paul's answers into the video, which is so fancy, so people can find them later. So if you have a question for Paul as we go along, please go ahead and use that ask a question button. And if you want to learn a little bit more about creating wicked students, there's also a button at the bottom of your screen called Learn More About the Book. And that'll take you to the Stylus website where you can learn a little bit more about it there also. So let's kick it off. Paul, I am super interested first in what are wicked students? How do you define them? For people who, I lived in the Boston area for a while. I feel like I have a general understanding of what this means. But for people who are like, what is this? What are wicked students? What do you mean by that?
Right. Well, it's interesting. I actually didn't encounter the term in Boston. I grew up in Wisconsin. So I first came across the idea of wicked in the context of wicked problems. And I was in Hong Kong, and I was met a gentleman named Edmund Coe, and he was a Stanford educated engineer who was then at Carnegie Mellon, and then I met him at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And he talked about these problems that engineers face that they're called wicked. They designate them as wicked problems because the parameters, the dynamics of the problem are constantly in flux, are constantly changing. The example he used was a Gulf Horizon explosion in 2010, where we didn't know exactly what had broken. We didn't know exactly how much oil was coming out. We didn't know exactly how much to fix it, or how to fix it, rather. We were getting contradictory data coming from the British and from the Americans. In addition, you've got tides and currents and an ecosystem being affected by all of this. So a wicked problem is a problem that is changing constantly, that's unpredictable, where the data is contradictory. A wicked student, in my mind, is a student who is prepared to address a problem like that, to solve a problem like that. And the way Edmund Coe always said it was, listen, if our engineers are going to face wicked problems, they better have wicked competencies. My response is, all of our students are going to be facing wicked problems. All of our students better have wicked competencies.
Okay. I'm sure this is not an easy thing to create in our students. We're going to dig into that a little bit more. But I am also really curious, and I think you've mentioned this a little bit, like the world has these problems. We need to be prepared to face them. This is part of the benefit of creating wicked students. But what are some of the other benefits that you see in really focusing on this particular thing in the classroom, and in particular in course design? Because really, in some ways, this is a course design book.
Right. Yeah, in a lot of ways, it's a course design book. Well, there's wicked problems in the world. I certainly want students to be able to address those, to deal with those. I mean, if you look at our political system right now, it's definitely a wicked problem. Our journalism, social media, all of that is wicked. But I also think in many ways for our students, their own selves, their lives, their sense of who they are, where they're going to go, that's a wicked problem as well. You know, they've got all this contradictory data. They've got the influences from their family and the influences from their social groups and the influences from their academic settings and all of those things. And who are they and how do they put these pieces together? One of my colleagues says it's like they come to college with a bunch of puzzle pieces. And what they want is to put those puzzle pieces into something whole that makes sense. And what do we do when they get to college? We give them more puzzle pieces, and we never give them the chance to kind of figure out who they are. So I think one of the benefits above and beyond sort of dealing with problems in the world and problems in a job is kind of figuring out who you are, having an opportunity to say, this is what I would care about, this is what I value, and to recognize that that's happening in a fluid situation.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, I'm really curious because I think one of the things we know about novice learners is that they may be more attracted to black and white and not gray.
Right.
Like
Right.
they really struggle cognitively to
Right.
understand these kind of
Yeah.
challenges. And
Yeah.
they might be very resistant
Yeah.
to these
Yeah.
kinds of
Yeah.
challenges
Yeah.
too. For that
Yeah.
reason, that they're like,
Yeah.
this is not fitting in my puzzle.
Right.
Like
Right.
you've
Right.
thrown more puzzle pieces at me. This does not make me happy. I'm curious for people who might be thinking like, are students ready for this? Like, especially when
Yeah.
they're coming in, many of them
Yeah.
are traditionally college age, they're coming
Yeah.
straight out of high school into these
Yeah.
classrooms.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Like to kind of get them into a cognitive place where they can really do this work.
Right. Well, and I think one of the interesting things is that sometimes the highest performing students are the ones who are most resistant, right? Because they've succeeded at this game, the academic game of black and white, and giving the right answers at the right times, and telling the teacher what they think the teacher wants to hear. And then for us to suddenly change the rules on them seems completely, to them, in their minds, unfair. In terms of getting them into the space, I think part of it is to recognize that the human animal loves puzzles. We like solving problems. We like figuring things out. And sometimes it's satisfying when we figure it out and it's incredibly clear. I very recently had a conversation with a student who's both an art history major and a mathematics minor. And she said about the mathematics minor, she said, sometimes it's just nice to have a clear answer, in ways that you don't get in art history. But other times there's a part of us that does like the art history and does like the ethical question and does like the philosophical puzzle and does like figuring it out. And I think in terms of getting students in that mindset, is finding ways almost right away to get them to play and to recognize the joy of play and to recognize the joy of arguing for a point where there's not necessarily a really clear answer. So for instance, I teach a course called Artistic and Literary Responses to Science and Technology. So it's a humanities course, sophomore level, designed specifically for mathematics and science majors. And what I'll do on the very first day of class is I'll walk in there and basically, without saying anything, put up a GMW Turner painting on the screen of his titles all run together for me, but it's a train kind of emerging out of the mist, and it's kind of abstract and it's kind of concrete. And I'll say to them, is this about the train? Is this a celebration of technology, or is this a resistance to technology? It's a pretty wide open question. I'm sure there's somewhere some JMW Turner experts who could tell you exactly the right answer to it, but I couldn't, and most of my students couldn't either. So we put it up there and I say, okay, now give me an answer. And then what are you basing your answer on? So that game of, okay, here's a puzzle, here's a problem, fine, yes, or multiple answers we can have, but also there's going to be answers that are clearer, closer to being supportable, and some that are not. So how do you find an answer and engaging that part of their brain? That was a very long answer. I'm sorry for that. But
that's a really good example. Yeah, I love that example. Well, I love this idea too that you brought up earlier about connecting with students on a human level.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes, many of us who are feeling like we're pretty advanced learners, we've been learning for a long time. We're embracing the gray. Sometimes we like black and white too. Sometimes that does make things easier, our students are not the only ones. Okay. Absolutely. So I want to pause here, remind our viewers and listeners, please feel free to ask your own questions to Paul using the Ask a Question feature if you would like. I have plenty of questions that I will continue to ask. But if you do have something specific based on what Paul is talking about here, where you want a more concrete example or an example for your discipline, let us know. So use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so one of the things that I was most excited about, Paul, when I read this book, and I did not see it coming, and maybe I should have, was that course design is such a cornerstone of what you were talking about. And I also love course design. I've also written a book on course design. So I was super excited to dive in. Why is course design where you took this, because it sounds like there's a lot of different angles that you could have approached this like kind of issue or challenge of creating wicked students with, and you took this angle of course design. Why is that important for creating wicked students?
Yeah, it's important because the end result, I mean, it's easy enough for me to give something like, I mean, my PhD is in Victorian literature, but I really consider myself a composition and rhetoric person. Um, I care about writing assignments and writing assignment design, and so oftentimes I I can create a really effective, wicked writing assignment design. Take Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin Market and give me three readings of it, three different ways of reading this single poem, and then argue for one of the three. You know, so that's a wicked problem. I can do that. I can give them a wicked question. Tell me three reasons why this class that you've taken for 13 weeks matters. You know, and cite texts as you're doing it. Those are wicked problems, right? You can't, though, throw somebody a wicked problem, a wicked assignment, a wicked assessment that's worth 5%, 10%, 30%, 40%. I've seen a syllabi where there's one project, end of the semester, 3,000 word paper worth 60% of the final grade. You can't do that ethically, in good conscience, unless you've taken them there. You know, so it really is. If that's the end product that we're after, the end thing that we want them to be able to do, great. But then you better be sure that you're having them practice it along the way, because that's complex problem solving. That's high risk. And if you're going to ask somebody to do something high risk, you better let them practice it. You better let them mess it up. You better let them try it in situations that are really simple, and then try it in situations that are more complex. So that's why, you know, it begins with not just the end product where you want them to be, but how are you going to get them there? What are the steps along the way?
Mm-hmm. So Anton has raised a really interesting point here in the chat of so mentions that published a book called Why Students Resist Learning. This topic is very important. I like the idea of creating and presenting these issues as puzzles for students, and I think a key to success here is to help them feel safe when they're stepping into this arena. And you've just mentioned like they're risk taking, they're doing all these things that feel really hard. So how do you balance that of like pushing them kind of off the cliff into being, you know, the solvers of these wicked problems, but also helping them to feel like they can do it in a way that, you know, they're not like burning their GPA to the ground, you know, like as they're engaging in this.
Right. Well, I talk about, gosh, I got to think about the terminology I use now. Proportionally graded assignments, minimally graded assignments, and ungraded assignments. And these assignments can be both things that happen in the class and things that happen, you know, within the classroom conversations, but also assignments that you give them that they turn in from outside of class. So minimally or ungraded is pretty clear, right? Something happens in class, you give them a puzzle, you give them a jigsaw, you give them something to do. They've got to answer a question, and they turn it in. And they get credit for having turned it in, but it doesn't count towards a grade because you want them to have room to mess up. Minimally graded is something more like what I call, you know, like a reading response assignment. You know, they every day for the reading, they come in with a one-page single-space typewritten response where they give a quote at the top, and then they kind of unpack the quote. No, I give that a check. Turn it in reasonably good. They get a check. And if they get checked 90% of the time, they get an A for that 10 to 15% of the grade. That's minimally graded. I call this white wine grading, by the way, for obvious reasons. It's pretty easy grading. It's conversational grading. It doesn't have a huge impact on their grade. And if they're doing it, they're authentically engaging in the conversation, good. And then proportionally graded is pretty obvious. First time they do it, it's 5%. Second time they do it, it's 10%. Third time they do it, it's 15%. But what this does is it gives them the opportunity to try to take some risks, to mess up, to try again, and to realize that that's the point. You know, I mean, most scientists, when they're running an experiment, it doesn't go right the first time or the first 10 times. So we need to create space for students to do that as well, to try, take some risks, mess up. And that's the only way they're going to figure out that they can do it.
Okay, so I'm really curious about this because I do think that this is an element of the classroom that's challenging in some disciplines. And you come out of a discipline, I think, where like revision is
Yeah.
a key element,
Yes.
of what you're training students to know how to do. How do you see this playing out across other disciplines in terms of, giving students lots of room to
Uh-huh.
play,
Uh-huh.
experiment, like try to figure out some of this stuff on their own, knowing, like knowing that they're going to fail a little bit and that's okay. That's part of it. Kind of point B to that question is how do you help them reflect on that failure?
hmm hmm So make sure I have the questions right. How does this play out in other fields, and how do we help them reflect on it in thoughtful, productive
Right.
ways?
Hmm.
Yeah, it does play out in a lot of different fields. I mean, computer scientists when they're trying programming, it's all about glitches and glitching and finding the glitches and solving the glitches. So if you simply had them do the program and turn it in the first time, nobody's going to pass. You need to have a process along the way. Same with designing. I mean, authentic science work in the sciences, lab experiments. And by authentic, I mean not something where it's pre-programmed and you know exactly what the outcome is supposed to be, and they know that you know exactly what the outcome is supposed to be, but they're actually trying to solve a problem. They're actually trying to experiment with something. My son this summer was working with a physics lab in town and did some computer programming where he was working in physics and trying to figure out variables and how things set up. But then they took that and they applied it to the Capitol Hill and people who crossed over various lines. And they knew that it wasn't working when Bernie Sanders ended up voting Republican 90% of the time. They knew something was wrong with the system, right? Um, so it does play out in other fields. And again, it's really about creating space to for them to try it and not get it completely right. A good example that would maybe solve both or answer both your questions would be my colleague Stacy Vargas, who teaches at Virginia Military Institute. And she came to me. She was frustrated with student lab writing assignments, and so the way that she finally ended up approaching this, the students will do 5 lab reports. She will grade the science. They either got it right or they got it wrong. But the writing component, she'll give them feedback, and then they can come in and um, revise 2 of those lab reports, 2 of the 5 lab reports, and then they'll turn in the revised lab reports. And then she has them do what she calls a contemplation. Um, I call it a reflection. Some people call it a meta-analysis, but she basically asks them, why did you change what you changed? What did you learn from changing this? How would you do it differently in the future? I think the thing about effective reflection is that you have to give them space there to be honest, and you have to complicate things so that there isn't a clear, predictable answer. Bad reflection is a student goes and does Habitat Humanity for 4 hours on a Saturday, and then you ask them to reflect, and they give this paper about how their whole life has changed because they did 4 hours of Habitat for Humanity. That's actually entirely possible, but that's not really what we want. What we really want is an honest answer that says, okay, what did you actually experience? What did it look like? What did it feel like? What would you do differently? So giving them options and giving them space to be honest, I think, is the main thing. I don't feel like that was a very good answer. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that publicly, but
I think it was a great answer. And the next question I have is going to let you expand on this a little bit because
okay.
one of the things, since we've kind of gotten into this discussion of grading, which I think is actually a really helpful, concrete thing to talk about when it comes to creating wicked students, I would imagine, and from reading the book, there are a lot of things related to responding to wicked problems that are non-cognitive skills. For
Right.
example, resilience, like needing to be able to bounce back when something
Yeah.
goes wrong and you're
Yeah.
not quite sure what you need to
Yeah.
do. That part of grading seems like it could be kind of complicated. Like how do you help students to understand that side of solving wicked problems when it's not something that maybe many people might feel like you can't really put it in a rubric, or maybe you don't want to, maybe you don't want it to be like a learning objective in your course that they have these non-cognitive skills for whatever reason you've decided you don't want to include that. But clearly it's an element of what we're talking about here. So I'm curious kind of how you handle that or how you think about it. Do you include it as learning objectives? Do you talk with students about in those kind of metacognitive discussions, like the temperament it takes, the patience it takes to be able to respond to these wicked problems?
Yeah, God, that's a great question, actually. Okay, so this is the point where I confess that on one of the classes that I teach a lot of is creative writing, and anybody who's not, in in the arts is going to go, well, no fair, no, that you get to play. But the funny thing about creative writing is a lot of people, a lot of students, when they come to it, want to approach it as either formulaic or absolutely wide open, so I can do anything I want. Well, in reality, creative writing requires students to understand, the elements of craft, and to apply them in productive ways. So I grade that. How well did you apply character in relationship to conflict? Beyond that, though, I do have, and there's a rubric that I include in the book for creative writing that says, listen, this is how we did creative writing before. Here are the formal elements of craft. You got them, or you didn't get them at all. So you're beginner, you're intermediate, you got them a little bit, and you're expert, you got them a lot. And I said, well, it's kind of a funny thing in the creative arts, but it's also kind of a funny thing in any scholarly field to simply end there, because finally we want all students to go beyond that. So I think what I do is, when students are at a beginning level, I'm simply focusing on craft. I'm simply focusing on, are you getting the things that you need to get? Are you applying them appropriately? When they get more advanced, I'll push a little bit more. That said, at the beginning levels, and again, I'll do this in Victorian literature, I'll do this in a formal writing class. I've got a class on a senior capstone that I'm teaching right now. I will push. I mean, I have in my, for the senior capstone, where they have to solve a big problem, one of my learning outcomes is students will take thoughtful risks that lead to dynamic, insightful conclusions that people haven't thought about before. Now, I'm teaching honors students. They really need to be pushed that way, because they're used to playing it safe. And I want them to not play it safe. I want them to take some risks. And so, yeah, I'll talk about the affective components of it. I'll talk about how life is not about simple answers. I'll talk about some of my own failures. And when they bomb, I'll try to find ways for them to celebrate that, to recognize that as a positive thing. And sometimes it's really hard for them, and other times they start laughing right away, and that's great. So.
Well, and this really does get back to this idea of just a safe space for students to have this happen, because we know when they leave us, they're going to fail. I mean, we all fail. This is like part of life.
Yes.
And who knows how much they have done that up to the point of coming to our classrooms. Okay, so I see Karen commenting on this too. We often leave it up to students too much to figure out what these soft skills or non-cognitive skills are in our courses. We're not explicitly talking about them. Karen, I think that's totally true. As wicked problems support development of non-cognitive skills, maybe transparency is the key, she says, to promoting students' appreciation of the value of wicked problems, like helping them to actively see how wicked problems and the problem solving you're doing is elevating these skills.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because in the book, I go into great detail about this concept of authority, where I talk about, it's both authority over, not authority in a domination kind of way, but authority over content. The students have learned the content, but then authority tying into authorship, creating something new. Now, I don't go into that much detail with that in my classes, because I don't want to bore the crap out of them, but I do talk about how we need to move beyond, how we need to be doing something new, how the point of studying Victorian literature is not to repeat things to me, but how to say something new and take some chances. So yeah, I agree with Karen. I think that's a great point. And I like the way she puts it too, the transparency idea.
Okay. So Paul, I'm always interested in origin stories. Books are such a time investment to do. So I'm really curious, like, where you came to this kind of topic issue in the first place, where you were like, obviously I need to write a book on this. Like, this is a thing. This is something I'm passionate about. Tell us a little bit about the origin story of how you came to be interested in this topic of creating wicked students.
Okay, I'm going to try to not let this can be I'm going to try to not let this be an hour and a half talk, okay? So you just make a gesture like this to let me know when you want me to cut off. Okay, I teach writing. I come from a writing background. I've taught writing since 1989 when I was at Iowa State University. And one of the things that always fascinated me about writing is you would have some students who were very, very bright and they knew the content and they were so smart and they just couldn't write. And it wasn't that they weren't capable, but they just couldn't. When they tried, the words just came out and they were mangled and difficult. And I remember once meeting a full professor at Hong Kong University, very smart guy. I mean, you don't get to be a full professor. Hong Kong University is one of the best universities in the world. You don't get to be a full professor there by luck. And this guy, when he found out I was a writing person, said, "Oh my God, you have to help me. You just please help me. Writing is such a horrible experience for me." So you've got these people who are so smart who should be able to do it, and they're not. And then you've got these other people over here who are, you know, reasonably smart human beings. You know, maybe they don't work as hard as they could. I've got a wonderful student. He knows I use him as an example. Bo is his name, and he was in one of my classes, and he was a B student, and he could have been an A student, but he just just wasn't that invested in it. And he would turn in these papers that be B minus, C plus, and I'm not sorry, take that back. No, he'd take tests, he'd get B's. He'd turn in papers, he'd get A's. And then outside of the classroom, he was writing for hunting and fishing journals. He was doing blog posts. So he was fearless when it came to writing. And it just didn't make any sense to me that the person who's really smart and has all the skills somehow isn't able to write, and the other person is. And it just, one day I'm walking down the street and I'm talking to my friend Gavin Brown, who's an assessment guy in New Zealand. And I said, isn't this fascinating? Some people can write and they shouldn't be able to, and some people can't write and they should be able to. And he looks at me and goes, "Paul, you need three things to be able to write. You need content knowledge. You need to know what you're writing about. You need skills. You need to know the discourse. You need to know what a thesis looks like in this particular area, or what kinds of evidence are appropriate. And then you need a sense of your right to put words on the page, that putting words on the page, you have the right to do that. That's a legitimate participation in scholarship." So I found that fascinating. And then when I started talking to Edmund Coe about these ideas of wicked competencies and how some people, again, have these skills and others don't, it just became clear to me that it was the same thing. It wasn't just about mastery of content. Our very, very bright students can go out into the world and sit at a beginning level job for 10 years. And some of our students who, are less traditionally bright, or academically high performing, go in and just master the world instantly. And again, I think it's kind of the same thing, that it's not just about content knowledge, although that's crucial. It's not just about skills, although that's crucial. It's about having a sense that you have the right to step into the world, look at a problem, and say, "This isn't right. There's a better way to do this."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that story. So I'm curious, Paul, because some people are listening to this and they're thinking, we're talking about millennials here, or
right,
wherever we are now, post millennials. Like, I don't know what we're calling them,
I don't know,
but our current students, and they're saying they're too confident. And it sounds like what you're talking about is a little bit of confidence. Like you have to feel like you have the right to do this. You have to feel like a sense of your self-assurance, that you can do this.
Yep.
How would you respond to that? I mean, have we just read millennials wrong? Like, are they really lacking in confidence in these areas? Or is that just kind of a misnomer we have about this population of students?
Yeah. I'm very, very specific about using the term authority. And part of that comes from Marcia Baxter-Magolda. She's got that wonderful term self-authorship. And I had a colleague, Kim Filer, who's now at Virginia Tech. She used to be at Roanoke College with me. And she introduced me to Baxter-Magolda's work. And I love that term, but I wasn't really interested in authorship of self. I was interested in authorship of the world. I wanted students to go into the world and be able to change it in creative, thoughtful ways. So I use the term authority very, very, very deliberately. I don't like agency, because a 3-year-old in the cereal aisle of a grocery store has agency. Okay. I'm talking about something more deliberate, something more
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful, something that comes from experience. I don't like the word efficacy or the word confidence, because both of those, I mean, every psychologist I've ever talked to, I say, so efficacy, you can have a sense of self-efficacy and you can be wrong. You're not able to solve that problem. They say, yeah, that's true. I actually want not just confidence or self-efficacy, but knowledge, experience. I've done this. I've been in classrooms where I've encountered difficult problems. I've figured out how to solve those problems. Now I'm moving into the world and solving those problems.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna take a pass on the millennial question, other than to say I really like them because they are kind to each other, very good people. They take care of each other in some wonderful ways. But I think I'm talking about more than confidence. I'm not interested in arrogance. I'm not interested in, once I was talking to a guy who was a billionaire, I mean, just with a B, billionaire. And I was talking about these ideas, and he just looked at me and said, no, you either have that or you don't, that sense of authority. When I tell that story to people who teach at community colleges, they get really angry because they know that their students are capable of powerful, powerful change. And they know that they have to attend to their sense of who they are, to these dispositional aspects, and putting them in a place where they recognize the power that they have. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really helpful differentiation. Okay, I wanted to give another call out to our audience members here. If you've got questions for Paul, use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to keep asking questions, whether you have them or not, because I've got some here that I'm still curious about. But please feel free to use that feature if you have a question for Paul. So one of the things I think I hear you saying, Paul, that creating Wicked Students and kind of designing courses around this can do is almost like giving students permission
mm-hmm,
to tackle some of this stuff. Like maybe
mm-hmm,
they haven't been invited
mm-hmm.
into these problems in the
Yes,
past.
yes.
So I'm curious about, how do you decide what are the wicked problems that you put in front of your students? Like, how do you kind of pick, like, disciplinarily or skill wise? Like, what are some things that you might advise people who are thinking, like, yes, this is interesting to me, but I'm not sure where I would start?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wish it probably isn't the answer I'm supposed to give, but everybody's discipline is going to be different. Everybody's student population is going to be different. So it's a tricky thing. I mean, the best way to think about it is two. I think I would give two ideas. One, teaching is a rhetorical act, right? I'm looking at some of the comments that Anton and Steve are putting up. If a faculty member walks into the room with in their minds the idea that these students are stupid and they need me to give them content, they need me to give them mastery of this stuff, students read that. Students respond to that. We rise or fall to the level of the construction of the person who's talking to us. If they have a diminished sense of who we are, it's harder for us to feel powerful and productive. So thing number one is to walk into the classroom and look at your students as utterly capable. Imagine them as utterly capable. Now, if they want to prove you wrong, fine, but you better begin there. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, though, is begin with the beautiful problem. I mean, begin with think about the things that you love about your field. Think about the questions that intrigue you about your field. I mean, if you talk to mathematicians. Okay, so I was in Utah at Weber State a couple years ago, and there was a professor I met who was in education. I think he focused on arts, but he had a big grant where he was looking at arts and at mathematics. And he said, here's what we do. We walk into an art classroom or a music classroom or a dance classroom, and we show them a beautiful painting, or we play them a beautiful song, or we show them a beautiful dance, and we say, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that amazing? Let me show you how to do that. We walk into a mathematics classroom. Not all mathematics professors, I've met amazing mathematics professors, but oftentimes we teach mathematics this way. We say, we have beautiful problems. That's what drew us into the field. But we don't talk about that. We just say, here's some crap, you need to learn it. Okay, because it's good for you. I think you begin by, what do you love about the field? What drew you into the field? What are the questions that fascinate you, that make you happy when you're working on them, that put you into flow? And then find a way to bring those problems to the level that the students are at, whether it's a first year class or a senior class or somewhere in between. Um, but assume that if you love those problems, they will too. That if there's a puzzle there, something truly intriguing, they're going to be drawn by that.
Mm-hmm. So we've had a couple audience questions come in, but I want to ask one more that I think is connected to what you were just talking about
Sure.
before we shift into those. And that is interdisciplinary wicked problems. Digging into that, because I think that what we see as professionals in many of our fields is, for example, federal grants are now going to cross-disciplinary teams,
Right.
cross-institutional teams that are
Right.
trying to solve these wicked problems from all these different angles.
Right.
We've talked about disciplinary wicked problems here. I'm wondering if you can talk about cross-disciplinary wicked problems. How do we engage our students in those larger discussions that might move us outside of our disciplinary silos?
Mm-hmm. 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 That's a great question. In some ways, oftentimes when I put up a slide, when I'm doing a talk about wicked problems, and I'll put a slide up there, one of the points I'll make, one of the things that defines a wicked problem is that it is interdisciplinary, um, because it draws from a lot of different areas. We tend to think about, our students, when they're in college, they have this wonderful thing where they can look at, if they for some reason forget where they are, all they have to do is look at the syllabus, and it has PSYC at the top, and they know they're in psych, or ENGL, and they know they're in English. They go into the real world, they're working as an architect or as a clergy person or as a nurse, and on any given day, at any given moment, they could be drawing from all over the place. So a lot of my other work is in general education, and there's a lot of overlap between liberal arts and general education, and these wicked problems for me. But one way I like to do it is in a class. When I've got a problem, when I present something to students, I encourage them to they're the experts. I'm limited. I've got my PhD in Victorian literature, and we know how practical that is. And here they are coming from physics, and here they are coming from social sciences, and here they come from political science. What can they say? What can they bring? What does their background tell them about this question, this situation in front of them? If you're reading literature, it's a social dynamic or a political dynamic or an environmental dynamic. So what can they bring to the table? In other words, it's great if a professor has interdisciplinary skills or can work with another professor, but the students are there in the room. They've got those skills as well. And if you're going to ask them to have authority, here's an opportunity for you to give them authority, to allow them to be the authority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a kind of a point that's been raised, or a question from Steve, who's also kind of pushing the boundaries of the classroom a little bit. And he says, when you teach a group for a semester, do their final papers indicate that if you have gained authority, or half or most? It's been his impression that such growth takes more than one semester to become visible. So can you talk about this idea of creating wicked students from a curricular perspective, of how do you take this kind of assignment, level work that they're doing and have it cross multiple courses?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I do think, I think any given course is only going to have very minimal impact on a student. I mean, part of it is just the number of hours. 39 hours over the course of 13 weeks is what we teach. And then they've got, a couple hours, or hopefully more than a couple hours outside, doing outside work and projects and stuff like that. And I think for most students, the average students, is going to be just small incremental steps until they hit that one class or that one professor or that one assignment that just clicks, and then they're going to explode. And suddenly what was incremental growth is going to be this massive thing. And that's when you don't recognize them. You're walking down the hall and you see them, and you don't even recognize them because the look in their eyes is so completely different. So yeah, I think the change that they make is small. Some students are going to be immensely satisfying. You're going to see that. Sometimes you're going to wonder if anything happened at all until you see them 3 years later, and then you'll know. For me, one of the things that lets me know that the class is working the way that I want it to work is when I get the good grades from the good students, I get good papers from the good students, but I get that B student or that C plus student who suddenly jumps up to a completely different level and hands me a piece of work they never thought they were capable of. I mean, they actually have a stunned look on their face as they hand it to you, or as they talk about it in your office. So to me, that's what you look for. Is you look, okay, the good students are doing great. Well, how are the other students doing? And if there's not much growth there, or there's no variety, if all of them are saying kind of flatlining and average, then room to tinker, room to play around, room to change things around. One of the questions I saw, or one of the comments I saw come up earlier, had to do a lot with content. One of the key things that I've heard, one of the key anecdotes I could tell you, years ago, I was at a conference, and my colleague Adrian Bloss, who's now at Shenandoah University, came up to me and said, "You got to talk to this guy named Bob Cape from Austin College. He's got this first year seminar, and this NESI data is through the roof. This is an amazing first year seminar that they have." And so I went and I sat down with Bob, and I talked to him and talked to him and talked to him. And I finally said, "Bob, I don't get it. I don't get how you're getting this NESI data when the seminar is just everything you're describing is very normal, very vanilla." And he looked at me and said, "Okay, I've got two rules. Rule number one is when you design the course, you set it at an intellectually demanding level. You put it up here. Rule number two is when you've done that, then you take a look at all the content in your syllabus and you chop out a third of it or a quarter of it to give them room to learn, to play, to risk, to try, to achieve these high levels up here." And I think part of it is saying goodbye to content and just recognizing that we can't cover all the content. We have to prepare students for content that they've never seen before. And that's a wicked capacity.
Okay. So we have another question, I think kind of related to this, from Karen.
Okay.
How do we help faculty see their role as sharing problems with students rather than giving them answers and then asking for them back?
Yeah.
She says, in other words, have you figured out how to overcome faculty resistance to using wicked problems?
If I
This
did,
is a good one, Karen. Thank you for asking this question.
Yeah. The short answer, Karen, is no, because if I did, I would have $1 billion and I would never have to work ever again. No, for that, figuring out how to overcome faculty resistance. I mean, no, it's hard, right? I mean, a couple factors drive faculty towards a content approach to their courses. Factor number one is institutional structures. So if they've got a lecture of 300 students, how do you go beyond lecturing and content delivery? Factor related to that, if they feel like this is an introductory course and there's an advanced or intermediate course later on, I've got to give them the content they need to get up here. Another factor is let's say things like, well, when I was a student, this is how it worked, and it worked really well for me, and look where I am now. The institutional thing is hard. When you have a large lecture, I think it's harder to do these things. I don't think it's impossible. The second thing, though, about how faculty sort of view themselves as, this is my role, this is what I mean, in many cases, the sage on the stage is the only model that a lot of faculty have ever seen. And it worked really well for them. And so cognitively, why should they change or move away from something that has given them all these rewards? I mean, if it worked for me, it should work for other students. The only way I found to address that second issue is, and when I'm in a workshop, if the hands go up and people start saying things like that, I'll just say, let's stop. And I'll cite Bill Sullivan, who does a lot of work on this, and he says that the percentage of undergraduates who go on to move into higher education, 1%, 2%, maybe 3%. In other words, and we're a very particular tribe. We are highly autonomous. We are in love with the life of the mind. We like solving, these abstract problems. So the only way to address that second problem with faculty is to simply say to them, we're weird. We're not normal. So anytime that you try to design an educational system based upon us, it's not going to work. And then to really talk about their students and where they want their students to be and where they see their students going when they graduate from college and what kinds of lives they lead. Um, yeah, I mean, it's that issue of, and the other thing I think is that content's easy, right? It's easy to design a lecture where you're just delivering content really efficiently. And then it's easy to design an exam that asks them to simply hand that content back. And then it's easy to look at the people who take that exam and look and go, oh, look, Bill got an A. Bill's really smart. So this must be a good exam, you know? But that's not really what we're after, finally. We're not really after only the good students getting good grades. We're after having our students move into a complicated, messy world and be able to respond to it in productive ways that Bill, who's very good at memorizing stuff, isn't going to be able to do finally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I'm curious about, to some extent, I think faculty, when they give these answers, because they come from a positionality of being an expert, and
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that's a natural place for
Mm-hmm.
many of our faculty to be, they genuinely feel like they're helping their students.
Right.
And so there's
Exactly.
also, I think, a mindset shift of
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
is more helpful to your students
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
place them into situations where they can
Yeah.
think about this stuff than it
Right.
is, not that giving them answers is unhelpful,
Yeah.
but this other thing could be considered more helpful. I
Yeah.
know Karen also has just added here, focus on their grand goals is a great answer. What do you really want your students to learn? This
Yeah.
could be the way in. So helping them to see, that this does meet their goals in a different way.
Yeah. And Karen, that answer is great because it appeals to something sacred to faculty, which is that we care about our students. Begin with that. We care about our students. What do we really want for our students? Good.
Okay. Paul, I am curious for people who are thinking about this. Maybe they haven't read the book yet. Hopefully, they're going to look into it. But they're thinking, like, what are a couple simple things I can do to start integrating this into my classroom? They may not be ready for like a complete overhaul of the course design, but they want to think about how can I create wicked students? Let's say I want to walk into my classroom tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
not on a Saturday, Monday.
Yeah.
I
Right.
want to walk into my classroom on Monday, and I want to think about, what are some things that I can do kind of immediately that would help me shift in this direction. Can you give a couple kind of smaller strategies that could be useful to people?
Sure. One thing I think would be to think about a wicked exam question. Even if you don't give them exams, just pretend that in your class you were going to give one. What would be a question you would give that would be a legitimate question for the content of your field, but that doesn't have a clear answer? So, for instance, years ago, I came across, I can't even remember where there was a biology professor in Virginia, and I think I heard it secondhand, where he or she, on the final exam for a physiology course, asked the question, could a Pegasus actually exist, a flying horse? Could a horse actually fly based upon what you've studied in this class? Answer the question based upon the content of the course. So that's a great wicked question, because it doesn't have a clear answer or a definitive answer. I mean, it's probably answers that are closer to the truth and further from the truth, but there's nothing. So what you're really focusing on is how the students answer it and how they're drawing from their fields. So here's where I'm going with this. If you imagine that question that you're going to give at the end of the semester, then think to yourself, okay, what are the questions I can ask tomorrow or on Monday in class? What are the questions I can ask along the way periodically? What are the little problems I can give them that don't really have a clear answer, but there are answers that are better and not better, and that will force them to really think about the content and the skills that they're developing, and begin by asking them those little questions. Another thing I like to do is lots of people use debates in their classes, right, for these ambiguous questions. Well, oftentimes what they do is they say, okay, your team is this, and you're the pro, and your team is this, and you're the cons, and and okay, get ready, and then we're going to do a debate. No, what you do is you go say, I want you guys to look at the pros and cons of this for your team, and I want your team to look at the pros and cons for this. And then you don't assign them their role until they've all done pros and cons on both sides. And then you say, okay, you're the pros, you're the cons, get up there and do the debate. And then they do the debate. And then you have a conversation afterwards where you say, well, okay, you guys were the cons. But say you were the pros, what would you have done differently than what they did? Or what did you like about what they did, and vice versa? So not only do they think about the question from both sides right away, then they debate it, then they think about the question from both sides again. So it's adopting different roles and complicating the roles and clarifying the point that it's not really about the answer you gave. It's about how you arrived at the answer that you gave and the things that you thought about. So little things like that, anything that puts the emphasis on process. As you pointed out, coming from a writing background, this makes sense. There's a lot of emphasis on process there.
So one of the things I think that's been kind of infused into a lot of the examples, but we haven't called it out in a really intentional way, is collaboration and asking students to work in a collaborative fashion or a cooperative fashion with each other. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of creating Wicked students? To what degree are they doing this by themselves? To what degree are they doing this in groups or teams?
Teams are always a handy way to complicate everything. And I mean that in a very positive sense. Collaboration is a wicked problem. My senior honors course right now, they're doing, it's a problem-based course, and they're all working in teams to solve a problem. And there are complications. Sometimes people get along and sometimes people don't get along. So collaboration is a wicked problem. So there's a benefit. One benefit of collaboration is that they recognize that they have to figure out a way to get this dynamic to work, and that it might mean me pulling back when I feel like I have the right answer, or I feel like nobody's doing the work. I'm going to push harder and harder. No, maybe you need to pull back. And when I feel like I'm not really sure, maybe you need to put yourself forward and take some risks. So the process, again, of collaboration can be very beneficial for figuring out how wickedness works. But the other thing, of course, is that different people, different viewpoints, and so simply bringing the complexity of thought into play in the collaborative setting can be really valuable. That said, I don't really, I may be focusing on a lot of collaborative problems, but I really think this is learned along the way in different settings at different moments in different ways. And I think that's what makes, I think different people are going to come at a sense of authority in different ways. For some people, it's going to be with an exam question. For some people, it's going to be sitting in their professor's office having a conversation. For some people, it's going to be running an organization on campus. For some people, it's going to be being the treasurer for their sorority. There's different ways that people come to authority. So I think the more variety of techniques that we bring into play, not just within an individual classroom, but across the curriculum, the better. And thinking both about curricular and co-curricular.
Okay, so I'm curious, Paul, what was the wicked problem for you of writing this book? What was kind of the challenging aspect when you were working on this project, trying to figure out how to pull these pieces together, provide these different examples? What was the kind of challenging element for you of working on this?
Finding the time, I mean, I teach, I've got kids, my partner, we both commute. We do 240 miles a day between the two of us, so simply finding the time. And then there was this other kind of weird, wicked problem is, I've never really talked about this before, but in my head, I had it all figured out. And I was pretty satisfied with, in my head, the answers that I had. And I didn't really feel the urge to put them down into a book. So simply getting the energy to write the book, I mean, my professional persona is not based upon writing and books. So, or at least in these areas. So just getting the energy, not the energy, but just getting myself the discipline. I don't know. It's sort of funny to say that. It's probably not what you expected as an answer.
Those are my favorite answers.
Okay, good.
I don't expect.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the structure of the book, it made a lot of sense, right? I mean, you begin with goals, and then you think about macro structures, and then microstructures, and then assignments, and then daily pedagogies. That all made sense to me. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
trying to do it in a way that wasn't too long too. I wanted to keep the book short. I wanted faculty to actually read the book. I love some of those other course design books. But man, some of them are long. There's
Hmm. Hmm.
400 pages, 600
Right,
pages.
right.
I don't have time to do that, to read that. So,
All right. So we have another question from the audience. Anton
okay.
asks, do you know of any departments that have explicitly adopted a wicked strategy toward curriculum development across their program? I think that really is a key to making this work in an institutional context.
Wow.
Good question, Anton.
Yeah. I bet you anything they're out there. I haven't encountered one that sticks in my head. I mean, if I have encountered it, it's when I'm just randomly searching for things on the internet and I'll come across something. I'm sure there's some design programs, some engineering programs that do that. But have you? Because if you have, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like Anton, if you've got examples, drop them
Yeah,
in.
please,
The other
please
one
let
I'm
us
thinking
know.
about, I mean, if there are curriculums that really focus on problem-based learning, like that's
Yeah,
where I would
yeah,
look is like departments who've really taken on a problem-based
approach.
approach. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that kind of comes to mind too is that recent announcement. Was it MIT that now is creating like a college of AI?
Hmm.
For artificial intelligence, and they created like a whole new college
Yeah,
of I think that's what it was. It came out like within the
yeah.
last couple of weeks, and that to me seems like if you're taking on that kind of topic and subject area, it kind of has to have like
Right. You
it's a
would
wicked
think.
problem, yeah. And
Right.
they're
Yeah.
investing tens of millions of dollars in the
Yeah.
creation of this, and
Yeah.
so that would be another thing I would look for is like kind of the more futuristic approaches to
Hmm.
trying to help students tackle things that are coming along that we don't quite know what to do with yet.
Hmm. Hmm. I
Maybe
mean,
that
one
would
thing.
be taking that approach.
Yeah. One thing that I find interesting is a lot of is when a department or a program recognizes that their curriculum itself is a wicked problem. That oftentimes we're using a curricular approach that is 100 years old or 50 years old or 30 years old and not really set up for the way knowledge works today. Um, and the students that we're working with today and the world that we're working with today. So I think when an institution recognizes that, then it becomes interesting. I mean, the mathematics program at Roanoke is right now experimenting a lot with mastery-based approaches. I oftentimes encounter scientists who are really frustrated with the degree to which their students don't carry over learning from one course to a more advanced course, and the complexity of writing lab reports and that kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The other thing that occurs to me as you're talking about that is the work on writing transfer.
yeah.
That may be an area where people are taking a more curricular approach to try to understand how students are taking writing skills from writing
Mm-hmm.
classrooms into their other curricular endeavors. So that
Mm-hmm.
might be something else. There is a quite a robust literature around that. And I know Elon University has been supporting some research seminars in that area.
Mm-hmm.
So that might also be something to look into
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are nearing the top of the hour here. We're going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone so much for spending the afternoon with Paul and I for this hour and for your wonderful, thoughtful questions. Of course, I want to thank Paul as well for sharing his knowledge, expertise, and experience with us, and for doing a deeper dive into
Yeah.
creating wicked students.
Yeah.
I hope you'll check out the book if you haven't already. And thanks, Paul. This was really fun.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you all of you who took the time to sit here and be patient with me as I talked about these things. I really appreciate it. So please let me know if you have questions. Feel free to contact me directly.
All right. And everyone, we will have a replay of this available, hopefully in the next 24 hours or so, and you'll get an email letting you know when that's available. Of course, you can always encourage colleagues to sign up for the Stylus Author Webinar Series so they have access to these replays. We did have 3 previous webinars earlier this spring of this year that you can check out in that same space where Paul's webinar replay is going to be housed as well. And keep an eye out for future Stylus Author webinars in 2019. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful weekend and a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Bye everyone.